All right, we're gonna get started for our final session this afternoon, in which we have a panel that will be sharing some synthesis and reflections, and then we'll open the floor. So the goal of this session is to give you access to the collective expertise of all the speakers, really. We chose sort of a sampling of speakers with different expertise, but they can call on any of the other speakers for backup, or you can ask us questions. But the idea is that you've heard a lot of different talks today, and it can be hard to, how do I make sense of all that? And so the panel has offered to help with a bit of that. And they're going to answer 2 rounds of questions. The first round is sort of a retrospective, what have we learned looking back? And the second round is a forward-looking sort of recommendations for the future. And I'm going to ask them to keep their answers at a sort of 30,000-foot brief level. I'm sure each of them could talk for 10 minutes about it, but at the sort of 2 or 3 minute level question. And so the first question is, share your perspectives on lessons learned from your own work, as well as the collective work that you've heard today. So we'll start with Wes.
Okay. So for my own work, I would say that looking back, we went with 3-month deployments for the muscle transplants. I think that was a good choice because it lines up with some of the other sampling. But I wish I would have done, muscles can accumulate metals and reach equilibrium really quick, like 3 weeks. I wish I could have, if I could go back in time, I would have done a few deployments at a shorter time span initially, that first quarter. And then I think one of the things that I shouldn't have been surprised by, but looking at the data, was just how much the biology of the organism was affecting the accumulation or the concentration. So like just really considering biology as well as the chemistry.
Thank you. Ivana, the question was sort of looking back at what we've learned from the past 20 months from your own work and from everything you've just heard. What are some lessons learned?
That's a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I apologize. I had to make coffee.
Can I have some?
Yes, espresso. And by the way, disclaimer, I grew up in Florence, which is nowhere around where you work.
Yeah,
manganese, so any intellectual, made that connection, there's no connection. So, well, yeah. I mean, I wish I can go back and sample the heck out of the place, first of all. And we just, we had to do everything rapidly. Definitely a much more extensive and concentrated sampling. We were constrained to working within our field sites because of private property. And I mean, I wish we could have done the thing, much broader area for sure. And we had more time to think what we were doing. We really were in a very reactive mode. We didn't have much time to think, and we were trying to collect as many data as possible. So now, looking back, I had all this great idea. Oh, I wish I did this. I wish I would collect all the samples. So, and our workforce, you remember, we're just a few of us, just trying to scramble, put together something. And yeah, I mean, that's the main thing. And I wish we were able to communicate more and better with everybody else. And I think that was a missed opportunity. We really tried to have conversations with the different agencies and local governing bodies, and just didn't work out really well in the end. So I hope that we can learn from that.
Thank you. And I'll say a question.
I think, what Alano just said, I would want to duplicate. I think the one, if I were to think of a mistake maybe that I made or would do differently, it would probably be to not assume that the people engaged in trying to do proper assessment of exposure and health risk, and then they could have gotten involved much sooner, and that would have been, building a proper study with human subjects approval to collect samples of air or whatever, from people, but even if we didn't have funding to analyze them, it could have been archived and to search for funding for analysis later, and probably something like that.
I think it did come as a surprise to all of us, expecting something like an oil spill response.
Yeah.
Full, chain of command and
Yeah.
experts descending on the scene, and it took us all a while to realize that it's just us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But can I say something? This is a great example because you talked about an oil spill response. So you know that there's an oil spill, everyone is looking for oil. Rather, in this case here, there was a burning of a battery storage facility and nobody was looking for transition from the metals. That's the part that surprised me. And we were, initially we're like, are we really finding what we are finding? We were doubting ourselves because nobody was even thinking about it. Everyone was going after hydrofluoric acid, right? And so the whole thing was about HF. And so I'm still puzzled about that because, right? Yeah. So, I mean, it's again, you have an oil spill and nobody's looking for the oil, they're looking for some gas that's being produced by the spill. But what about the actual oil? All right.
I would add on that, I mean, how many people that are in the Santa Cruz County area even knew this facility existed before it got on there? I didn't.
Barely.
Very few people, I think, actually knew. And then to find that it's the largest, or one of the largest in the world. Yeah. I think there was, there just wasn't a lot of awareness of that, which I think contributed to sort of the slow response, or at least the awareness.
Before the batteries went in at Moss Landing, there were, the big smokestacks,
Yeah.
and we know. I'm not really sure what was going up those smokestacks. Like when I was growing up, I thought that was just steam coming out of there, but it wasn't.
I'm not an expert in that, and that's known.
Maybe there's someone.
There's someone here who knows that.
They aren't in use anymore now. I
Sure,
believe,
yeah.
but,
Well, you're right.
Went this offer, they didn't make them 500 feet tall for no reason.
Right.
I'm actually an alumni of Moss Landing Marine Labs as well, from years ago. And I remember back in these probably the 80s, that an oil tanker would come and anchor out here and pump oil in the facility because they would burn that, I think, to generate electricity. So I'm assuming that the stacks, and we used to actually, because we go surfing here, we could look at from Santa Cruz, look at the stacks and see which way the winds were blowing, and know whether it was offshore or onshore. And we just come down. So they was very active in energy production, and I thought they at that time, at least for part of it, were consuming oil when they.
Yeah. All right, I think your answers to the retrospective question are gonna lead directly into the second question I had for you, which was looking forward. What would you recommend either as next steps here locally for understanding fire impacts at Elkhorn Slough? And more broadly, what would you recommend be in place for here or anywhere else to be prepared for such environmental disasters as we've had here? So maybe Wes, we'll start with you again.
Okay, yeah, so I'd like to see a continuation of what we're doing here, and then it was brought up this morning in some of the talks, we're ready for the next step, which is looking at those compartment models, getting into more of a mass budget for these metals instead of just concentration work. I think that's going to be really important, as well as the metal uptake experiments in the labs are getting some control on that. So I think just kind of summarizing what was talked about earlier this morning, I think would be really valuable as the next step. And I know your model, like there's a lot of Ks there. Each one of those are going to represent a tremendous amount of work to get accurate, fluxes, but you start to frame that in and you start to get an idea of how those metals are moving through the Elkhorn Slough. And then just to reiterate baseline data for new areas, if they're highly connected to kind of estuaries or nearshore oceans, there's on both coasts, there's already big networks for NOAA Mussel Watch. Reach out ahead of time and the battery technology is changing, so maybe it's not cobalt nickel anymore, maybe it's something else. Partner with people who are already doing things in those areas and have kind of as part of the permitting or whatever, these, that's not unusual, right? Like PG&E has to permit for the new plant, they have to do monitoring for that. So it's not something that is all that new or unrealistic to ask for these facilities.
Yeah, I'm shocked to hear you promoting mussels as the.
Well, there's, just because it's cost effective, but any baseline around. And so that's not going to be possible if the facility is not connected to somewhere where there's mussels, but there would be maybe some other work going on in those environments that would be important to tap into.
Certainly for the biota group, we wish there had been a few species selected to be the sentinel species, from pillbugs to mussels to whatever, that we had just some collected every year in the freezer. And there's going to be other emerging contaminants and pandemics, and just having a baseline of samples in the freezer to analyze for future disasters would be great.
There's not humans in the freezer, please.
Ivano, what are your recommendations for here locally as well as more broadly?
Yeah, well, I definitely, whatever Wes said, I completely agree. I mean, and so I think we established how important baseline are. And I would say, one of the things that I was pointing out during my presentation is the kind of start thinking more ontologically, meaning about reality rather than getting stuck on words. And one of the words that keeps coming back to me is surface. And some of the protocols that have been established obviously are designed for generic purposes. And so we should start thinking about learning from the lesson we learned here at Moss Landing, how we can be better prepared to measure, detect future spills, whatever they are, and connect the academia with the agency and the different stakeholders, because we have this amazing potential, and also the scientific literature, which is also making a lot of progress. And it seems to me that some of the government agencies are kind of a little behind with that, and there's almost like a tension why there should be more collaboration, because we're not trying to make a point here, we're trying to figure it out together, and so we can do that with probably more humility on both sides, and open mind, and so I'm looking for. I hope that this eventually is going to be a good thing in the end, if we can get something out of it, because as you mentioned before, this will happen again. It's happening somewhere else, maybe in different ways, but so let's be prepared, and let's be also very open, because the public needs to know. We can't treat the public as they were there, they were able to digest information. They can, just give them the right, give me the honest information, and that's my take.
Yeah, the connections that you mentioned, I mean, this room, this symposium is an example of where diverse research groups and universities and conservation groups and the community are working together. And to me, it has also been puzzling, having never been engaged in this sort of an endeavor, how uninterested the official investigators were in talking to us repeatedly. We kept offering, we have data to share, we'd love to talk, we could be advisory, and there never has been any connection between the official investigations and us. And if there are ways looking to the future that one can build that in, that you draw on the local expertise. I don't know how those bridges get formed, but some sort of tighter connections.
Probably by this type of situation. I think this is a pretty new event overall. So maybe this is actually one of the examples that will start a different type of future conversation. I'm hoping. I mean, I don't see why not. And also one thing, if I may add, we don't like to pay taxes. But it's important to pay taxes and support the local government and the state. So what I'm trying to say is that they're also usually overwhelmed. They being, whomever we want to do something whenever we need them, and then we complain because we don't want to put too much money in the government. So it's important they get funded. They can hire also experts. I mean, I think they're really, and I think about the counties. I mean, they're scrambling. We think Monterey County is a huge county, and they have so much going on, so they're stretched, and so they do their best to. I mean, to be, I want to acknowledge that. I mean, so. Yeah.
Thank you. And John, your forward-looking thoughts and recommendations?
So I'll start with something that I'm not at all an expert on, and that is, it seems that there's an opportunity. Let me back up. I've learned that oftentimes there's not much of a relationship between the concentrations of something in an organism and the adverse health outcome, particularly at the population level. And that this could be a tremendous opportunity looking forward, particularly for the SLU environment, to look at sort of species diversity, population dynamics over the longer term. So it's a longer term kind of a monitoring thing, and how that might compare to other, similar in terms of ecosystems, kind of estuarine environments. That could be a tremendous opportunity to think about that. And because in terms of wildlife and so on, I think many people recognize that it's not necessarily the individual that matters, it's the population that really seems to get a lot of attention, and of course plays a very important role. So I think that would be one thing to think about, is how to build those kind of long-term monitoring programs of populations and organisms, as opposed to trying to really understand the levels. We know, like I mentioned, that the levels that we might measure to something, those are the bulk levels, and we all know that it's much more complicated than that in terms of sort of biological receptors in an organism that may be susceptible, the speciation of these metals in the environment now. So that gets, kind of complicated to try to, and sometimes maybe, overly hopeful to think there's going to be a direct relationship between concentration of something and that. Now, moving on from that, I think this is mentioned here, there are a lot of good examples, like with the ocean spill response program, that we have a facility at the submarine campus at UC Santa Cruz. It was built, paid for in part by, not entirely, by petroleum companies. Why can't we think about having some kind of an escrow account or something for these kinds of companies, and to have some, in terms of an emergency response plan that's generated before the facility becomes operational, so that when something happens, there are the resources there, they're not tapping the local county, environmental health, public health resources to extract, but there's resources already set aside and that could be activated in you. So that if there is a significant, event, impacts that could be minimized by a rapid response.
Yeah. Any other wise thoughts before we open the floor to questions?
Wise.
Or unwise?
We're running out of wise thoughts. It's been a long day.
I'm gonna stand here so I can look over at the Zoom table as well as the audience for questions. So now for the remainder of the 40 minutes we have, or whenever you run out of energy and Zoom runs out of energy, we're gonna just do a Q&A about anything you've heard today, which will go first to the panel, but you can bounce to other people as you like.
Christine, thank you. And I know I keep stepping into questions. I apologize, but a couple of important details. Number one, the highest authority, the local level that approved this facility was the planning commission, not the coastal commission, not the board of supervisors. It was a change of equipment and presented that way. We now know it was much more than that, right? In regards to things that can be done, if people go to our website, a colleague sitting next to me, Ed Mitchell, and others put together a very specific list of things that could be done to make sure in the future that these are properly monitored in real time. The things like drones that can go in the air immediately at the cost of the operator, better training for your local fire department. This particular facility, the worst case scenario that was presented by the company was that one rack would burn for no more than 1 day. How is that possible when you've got 100,000 racks or whatever the number is? How is it that the worst case scenario is one rack when your exposure is 100,000. So these types of things are what we're learning, but there are several recommendations at the site about what could be done to improve public awareness, public health, and reduce the risks of something like this happening in the future.
That's a comment. Do you have a question?
No, sorry. Thank you for asking.
You were great.
Dash.
So I don't remember, Christine, if you were with us, we went on a tour of the building before it burned, about 9 months before it burned or something. Anyway, you know, obviously, that's not the way they build battery plants anymore. It's very different, and the chemistry is changing. Now, it seems like the newest standard is lithium iron phosphate batteries. I'm wondering if you guys have any insight into like the toxicity or, you know, supposed to be more stable, like less prone to thermal runaway. That as far as the constituent chemical, you guys have any knowledge of that?
I think the best job we can do is not to speculate on things that we are absolutely
Yeah.
not expert on, and that's something that I like to add. I think everyone should do their jobs, and that's how you get credibility and you know, an honest response. So yeah, I mean, I definitely.
I agree.
I can answer that question. The difference between the batteries that were used here and the ones that are being proposed is yes, they are harder to ignite and go into thermal runaway. But when they do, they're twice as good.
Yeah.
So, the threat to any community that has battery storage coming in is that it might catch fire. And if it does, what is a reasonable worst case scenario? It's not one stinking rat. It's where you get thermal runaway, and what are you going to do in that case? And if the person the company that's wants to make billions of dollars can't answer that, don't approve it. Our friends in Santa Cruz County, Never Again Lost Landing, reached out to them early and tried to share information that we could, like the question of the battery difference.
All right, maybe we'll take a few questions from Zoom, and just to Ivano's point, our panel here has expertise in the science related to the presentations you heard, and so there's clearly some very important policy and energy questions being raised here, but that's not what the panel is going to be able to speak to. So if you have questions, specifically in their wheelhouse, you'll get better answers from them. Amanda, you want to offer a Zoom question?
Sure. We have one asking if, can we estimate how much heavy metals fell to the soil in agriculture areas? So maybe that could speak to the way that one calculates those depositions and the amount produced from the fire.
Well, we cannot. Because our surveys were within the marsh restoration area. We do know that there was a report actually by, I think, some folks at UC Santa Cruz, that they did study some ag soils, but they were using the kind of the standard EPA method, which is with like 16-inch cores, or so they found nothing. But that goes back to the point that they might have missed this in veneer. But the answer is no, we cannot, and we should not.
We could calculate though, from the source material and the source materials that burn, what it was released into the atmosphere. As to where it landed, difficult to determine, but.
Yeah, so that would require a piece of information that I don't have, which is how much is missing. The before and after at the battery storage facility, which I don't have that number. We still don't even know the chemistry of the battery. I mean, we all found that we pretty much figured it out, because what we found is pretty consistent, but we don't have any evidence. So, but the answer is we just can't speculate.
Yeah, and that is very frustrating. We don't know, because all of us scientists have asked the question, what was the chemistry of that specific battery? And I've yet to find it. the exact chemistry of the batteries that were used. We can make some assumptions, in which we've done, the NMC type, battery materials,
I think
but
I would put my money on the 532. I mean, I think we got to figure it out. I think we know that at this point.
yeah, from a transparency standpoint, that is an area that's lacking. The transparency of the communication of the information from Vistra, from the EPA, from the people who approve this, is lacking. Because that would be, that's important information from us to take, moving forward.
Well, in terms of the agricultural question, I mean, you heard a presentation on metal concentrations in plants being high and on marsh soils and Hester. I think if we had this crystal ball of could do it all again with infinite funding, sampling agricultural fields in the vicinity of the slough in comparable ways of plants and soils in hindsight would probably have been a great idea. And I think it was one of those things we thought was happening. And maybe it did, but at least I don't know of any results in that regard.
I'm gonna make a housekeeping comment. I wonder if it would be helpful for those of us in the room when we're talking to announce who we are for the online folks before we start talking.
Of the questioners,
Any of us, yeah.
yeah.
Also speak up to the
whole room you guys are discussing.
Good tips, good tips. Okay, Steve can model speaking loudly, introducing himself.
I'm Steve Longhart from the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. So Ivano, you had on your second talk a slide that showed kind of the process, and you talked about actually, writing a paper or a series of papers that include steps in the process, the decision-making framework, etc. And we just did that for Black Abalone rescues, and it's resonating with me. The question is, and I know you said don't bring policy into it, but because I'm a scientist that works for a government agency, the key is, as scientists, you can present, here's what you should do, baseline. You should have samples stored. You should have an endowment, like in, for responsible parties that put money into it so you can have a rapid response, etc. How do you take a science paper, which I very much agree needs to be published, and now get that to the right people who are not in this room, which are not county supervisors, they're not state, maybe they're state legislators, assembly members, or state senators, but the utility people, like in the energy, the CEC or whatever, getting some of those people to actually adopt the paper that you write or aspects of it and incorporate it into the permitting process. So when an environmental impact study is done, baseline data are collected, and that's already put on to the applicant. That you have money set aside as part of the application procedure to set up a fund that can be tapped during an incident, just like an oil spill response. So how do we go from being a room of scientists and concerned citizens to getting it to the state? Because I thought the county could do something, but supervisors, Church, I think it's, he made it pretty clear that that's not an effective means because the companies can bypass them. So how do we make the state change something? And how do we get those people into the conversation to change how the state does its business using the advice of the scientists like yourselves to guide them to make better, more informed decisions on how to permit, install, monitor, and then respond to events when they happen in the future, because they will happen. Maybe you don't have the answer, but I'm just throwing that out there. As that's something we all struggle with the scientists, is we do the science, we hope we hand it off to somebody and they do the responsible thing in their agency and run with it. But often the case, it requires lawyers, lawsuits, travesties to happen to actually instigate the change that we all saw was necessary beforehand.
Yeah.
So I'm going to answer that by putting one of my colleagues on the spot. So I think as scientists, speaking for myself, I was naive thinking that what was missing in in impacting policy or legislation was just the information. And then we generate the information and still nothing happened, and we realized it's not just the gap of information. There's the momentum and the pressure it takes to convince people to take something on and make a decision. I don't know, Myra and I have been working on the lead-based ammunition, condor, lead exposure poisoning thing for years. And this is where this experience comes from. I don't know if Myra wants to comment on her experience about how it really takes a collection of groups. So the science is one small part of it, but there's a lot of other pieces that seem to have to work in concert to move decisions forward so they can incorporate it into policy or regulations or whatever. Myra, do you want to?
Well, I just say that I just feel like as scientists, you have to realize that no one's really gonna read your paper.
Oh, I know.
You have to go to the agencies that you want to, and you have to tell them. So that's what we did with talking about lead poisoning. And like that, we've worked on in different areas to try to get resolution and to get it fixed. So it just takes working with groups like Never Again Lost Landing and working with policy and just working with everyone and putting forth science. First publish it,
Yeah.
then you have to step outside of your office and your day job and just start talking to people. And testify before government agencies and talk to them, and sometimes it's not comfortable, sometimes you get sued by various agencies for unpublished data, but you still just, that's what you need to do, I think. It's not a quick,
I know that.
yeah, so.
But thank you for bringing that example up, because it's easy to sort of reach into despair and think we're never gonna get anywhere. And I think the Condor story is a really good story of how the science ultimately changed policy and protected wildlife. So thank you for that hopeful example.
Can I reply though? No, because, thank you, Mara. So well, two things. First of all, that slide you mentioned, actually, this is part of a proposal we just submitted last week with the RNRF. I can never remember the name, the Renewable Resource Fund. So that proposal is specifically to start working on this model and find out, start experimenting with this transfer coefficient. But the proposal itself is to educate, so to speak, the public and reach out to public agencies and for that purpose, exactly, to involve them in this process and share with them what we learned from this lesson. So we actually applied for funding that will allow us to have a workshop. It might sound naive, but actually that's one way of doing it, which is offering, say, okay, we seek funding independently. And, again, we're always talking about little pots of money here. We're always scrambling to pay for the $110, $150 a sample thing, while there's billions of dollars. It's so interesting. We have these little tiny guys, with giant corporation, but still we're doing our job. So that's what you saw there. So it was part of the proposal. So it's not going to be a paper, it might be a paper, but it's really we're proposing to create a tool that other people can adopt or might not, but it's available. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I like to I already said it before, but I think it's really important for all of us to stick with what we know, scientists, be very, very careful about what we say, because, when we do experiments, we shouldn't be buying the result. We should make sure that whatever we found is, first of all, we never prove anything. So whenever you hear someone say, I proved this, no, you can't prove anything. You can only disprove, first thing. And that's really important, because eventually somebody's gonna find out that there was something that can be changed. And second, it's really important to stay with your range of expertise. And that's how you can really make a change. Like how people that might have different opinions might actually listen to you, because you're going to have an investment in a result. That doesn't mean that you're not a human being, you don't feel, you don't think, but it's really important, because especially these days, I mean, anyone can come up with anything online and stuff. So stick with your story, stick with your science, right? And that's how we can really make a difference.
We could take a question from Zoom. if there's questions. Amanda, Max, do we have questions?
We do have one that keeps popping up, and it's a question that's directly directed at Professor Aiello. And the question is, how do you intend to work with the California Energy Commission, which has not yet acknowledged your work as seminal and applicable to future planning and response?
Me,
You can, yeah.
I don't even know it's the California Energy Commission, so I don't know. We hope we're here open for conversations and help. I mean, that's all we can do is to offer open doors and I don't know
Some
who
of the
else.
people who had signed up from Zoom are staff of the Energy Commission,
Okay.
so hello, you're there.
Yeah.
Listen up.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah.
And there is another question that pops up as well, which regards lithium. And the question is, I guess it's for Wes and Ivano, why is it that we don't have much lithium data yet? Can you comment on that so we can move on from this one?
Well, it's expensive. So we have some lithium data, but we're not presenting any of it yet. And for certain matrix, lithium's really difficult to analyze on ICP-MS because of interferences. So, you know, it's not being ignored on purpose. But the lower hanging fruit is to focus on the cathode metals.
Yeah, and yeah, so lithium is very light. It's a very light element, so it's very close to the detection limit of many instruments, and in particular, X-ray fluorescence does not have the ability to discern anything heavier than lighter than sodium because it's just in the background. So for this purpose, we focused on the other element for which we can actually determine concentration quite correctly, but no lithium. Yeah.
I'd like to add something to the previous answer about dealing with laws or getting the rules, standards changed. It's based upon Tanya Rivera, Brian and myself talking to John Laird in offices of church right here down the road. And we were trying to get him to work on the wording of a bill that he was trying to pass forward that eventually got passed. And one of the things that wound up in that bill is that the operator was supposed to coordinate and talk to the local community fire department, etc. What's wrong with that? Or you can talk about anything. How about butterflies and coffee at lunch? Or you can talk about the worst case scenario and what will that look like if we have a thermal runaway. So you can pass bills that are worthless even after you try. So you have to watch the wording and try performance-based requirement that might protect the local community. So let's take Santa Cruz County and their possibility of a storage facility. That is a question we recommend to advocates like us to try and get the board of supervisors and others to incorporate. And if you don't incorporate talking about the worst case scenarios, you don't know how to respond. You don't know that you need aerial coverage with drones. With things like that. That was our experience. We were trying to go beyond based on what we've learned from great folks like you. And it made like a sham correction.
We have a question from Petra. Let's do Wes's suggestion of introduce yourself too, please.
Sure. I'm Petra Deakins. I'm the director here at Moss Landing Green Lab. And I'm sorry, it's not a question, it's a comment. I just wanted to comment on this sort of philosophical conversation y'all are having about how you take science and then take it to policy. And I just want to say that like Moss Landing has this really amazing graduate program and we educate our students and prepare them for a variety of careers. And I really think that getting people into agencies, into the Energy Commission, into government who have the ability to take the scientific papers and understand them and translate them is important. So elected officials, agencies and all of that, and I think we should not ignore the importance of the education in that process of taking science and translating it into policy.
I don't know if I could put Rachel on the spot as an example of somebody who followed that pathway that might be willing to sort of highlight what your career pathway looks like.
Yeah, so I got my PhD at Elkhorn, worked at Elkhorn for my dissertation. I now work for the Coastal Commission. I will say as a general example, I now write special conditions for permits where if the public or the research community contacts me and says, hey, this project is coming up. I would love to see this monitoring happen, XYZ. I think it's important to have this baseline data. Historically, I have at times written conditions that speak to that. So that's a project by project basis. And, that's a very generic example, but I have seen that done directly where people suggest that based on research have made their way into prescriptions.
I don't know, so. Jacob,
I kind of followed up on that.
and introduce yourself.
Oh, my name's Jacob. I've been part of the field, the IOTA team, collecting samples of invertebrates and plants from the field. And I really appreciate all of your perspectives, and I'm thinking a lot about like, okay, where can we have impact and collecting data is like, we've identified barriers to connecting with policy and state agencies. And you guys all spoke really well to individual scientists and individual research efforts. And you've spoken also to building public trust in the science. And you everyone that presented today, I think has really good examples of doing that. So thinking about things we can impact here, what do you see the role of the university in facilitating that impact? And Pedro mentioned education and students, but like the university itself is in a position of power, and you all three have a lot of experience with the university system as well.
Well, what? I'm not a professor. I don't teach. I'm part of the university, but I'm not part of the university. But I will speak to, at least for my own lab in PSL, I feel like I would say we work with students here at Moss Landing and provide hands-on experience on projects or maybe support their thesis work. And I am proud that MPSL has been a real conduit for scientists to move into positions at the Water Board or at Fish and Wildlife or various other state agencies that then in their positions there have a much more hands-on view of the projects that they're overseeing because of the experience that they've had doing real research, doing hands-on work in the field.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I see the university in terms of institution as sort of a place where innovation can occur with the training and education of students, of course. But it's really a two-way thing with the students bringing that excitement and interest and want to engage in something. And I think almost without exception, the students that we get involved in the work we do, they all want to make an impact on something that goes beyond just themselves. And so the university environment provides, I think, a vehicle for that, the training, the education, the innovation, oftentimes the presence of facilities like scanning electron microscopy, other things that don't exist in most other technical consulting labs or whatever. So that's really important, I think. And so I think universities, are the core, the foundation of this generation of new knowledge that is really driving our understanding about how these problems present themselves and what we might do to find solutions to it.
Yeah, and I can add to that, two things. First, that instrumentation like the scanning electron microscope, all the other fancy things you see here, they're all grant-based. most of them NSF sponsored, so the role of the National Science Foundation is so important. It's, you know, and I'm very worried about our ability to continue to do the things that we can do now. So, so this is all taxpayer funded, by the way. My salary, the instrumentation, everything you see here. So the value is incredible. And the other thing is, on top of everything else, is the, you know, I always think, can I actually have a real job in my life? And the answer is no, because my job, it feels like it's a job. I mean, I work all the time, but I'm free to investigate. I do have fewer constraints, which are right. I mean, I need to do my duties, but I have this freedom of investigation that is such a valuable thing, which means that I can step out and go after the Moss Landing battery fire and just pivot completely overnight all my research. And I, you know, so and I don't have anyone that's telling me, no, this is not convenient, don't do it. Or so that's very valuable. So the freedom of research, it's one of the fundamental things. And it comes with some costs. Let's be honest, because you know, giving independence to folks sometimes works the other way. But I would say here at Moss Landing, you have an example of an incredibly talented faculty group and researchers. I mean, everyone is fully invested, you know, beyond, you know, whatever they're, you know, paid or expected, you know. So freedom of investigation, same thing for our students too. They should have the freedom to ask a tough question and then support from funding agencies such as NSF, because ultimately we need the federal government to support us, because one of those instruments costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know. So that's what I would add.
Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma. I'm a grad student at UCSC. With the talk of policy and the great mention of like students and universities, I was kind of really curious if you think there's the possibility for, or maybe already written into the grant that you guys have submitted for this like project on making a potentially useful document, the room for involvement of like social scientists or people who spend a lot of time thinking about this policy pathway that would maybe take some of the burden off of like kind of division of labor. Like you guys are doing all of this great science. Is there room for involving some of these people? Like I know there's the Science and Justice, like there's lots of great organizations.
And I can answer a bit of that, just like the National Estuarine Research Reserve System really champions collaborative research where from the get-go, you identify the key end users of the research. So you're not just passing over the science on the silver platter at the end, hoping it's used, but finding out, you know, what are your scientific needs when you hit a crossroads, what is it you need to know? And we design projects with them from the start. This one was very different in that we were just sort of thrown in the midst of it. I never set out to change the California Energy Commission's mind about anything. I just, you know, so we're having the scramble to figure it out after the fact. Then there's really great guidance, like on the National Estuarine Research Reserve webpage about collaborative science, where you start from the very beginning talking to the people who are going to be making the decisions and figure out what do they need. You build trust with them, you do joint fact finding with them, so you know you're partners with them from the start. So we just didn't have that luxury for this one, but you know, maybe for future grants we could build in some of that. So I stole that, but please, from the more university perspective.
Well, did reach out, but I don't have anything else to add to that, actually. Well, that's what program you're doing?
I'm in EEB.
Okay, because we know at Santa Cruz, we do have a coastal science and policy master's program that tries to do just what you're asking, right? So I thought maybe you're a plant and ask that question.
I did let my buzzer brag about.
Oh, there.
It is a side eye.
Does Zoom have some more questions for us? Excellent, Dash.
Yeah, Dash Dunkel, Elkhorn Slough Foundation. It seems like one of the hurdles in this has been like the cost of the samples. And prior to the battery fire, I'd never seen an XRF. And that tool seemed so valuable that you didn't have to, like, obviously it has limitations. You didn't have to send it off and wait 6 weeks for your hundreds or thousands of dollars of samples to come back. I'm wondering, are there any other tools that you can see that would be helpful? And obviously, these technologies are changing and the science is changing too. So I'm wondering, what do you see on the horizon that would help us monitor or process samples better? Or, where do you see the field going? I guess we're in.
So, yeah, and as I mentioned before, if you were in my early presentation, every tool answers different questions. So that's always very important. So there's not one thing that does everything. They all give you different perspective, different evidence, and then you put everything together. So, well, one of the things is that there are experimental, we were talking about particular concentration in our samples. They're actually experimental XRF. They actually measure the composition of the particles, because someone made a comment about it's not just the concentration, what you're breathing, right? Because if you're breathing whatever concentration of pollen versus metals makes a difference. So it's not just the size, and it's also the composition. And so I've seen some experimental. Actually, I think there's some. I think there are actually more than experimental. They already sold instruments that can measure concentration and analyze the particles. So that would be great to deploy in case of a fire. That's what I can think of. And XRF technology is becoming incredibly useful. I mean, and every year, those instruments get better and better in terms of both identifying and quantifying elements. And there are caveats, especially when you work in the field. If you work in the slough, you saw the picture, you sink in the mud, you're just, so, but that's how you collect data, right? And and they're getting cheaper too, by the way. So they used to be really, really expensive. Now they're still in the order of tens of thousands of dollars. But again, we're talking about peanuts compared to, millions. So I don't know if there's anything else that.
I think the remote sensing, which is what I think you're sort of talking to, is a great way to think about going forward, because for just the particulate load, they have those sensors just looking at the PM10 or PM2.5, as well as ones that can measure the composition, like Brandon just mentioned. They can be placed at sort of breathing level, and some of those instruments actually are gotten down to less than $1,000. So you could spend $50,000 and buy a whole bunch of them and cover a huge area. And $50,000 in terms of research instrumentation is really nothing.
Yeah.
And these are instruments that have mostly long lifespan, can report their data remotely. That would be a tremendous thing to think about. Because even the communities around here where there's been this enormous deposition of particulates enriched in these metals in the estuarine and terrestrial environments, I think what we should all be wondering about is what's the potential they're going to be resuspended? Because in terrestrial environments, the resuspension of dust that gets been tracked into homes where kids live and kids are crawling around the floor. I mean, those are the things that we should be thinking about moving forward, about a legacy of this event potentially impacting, people in the future.
Yeah. I have a kind of related public health question, like two parts. So how could we have, I know that we came into this kind of in an emergency, and all of these presentations were, in this emergency, we were pulled in, came as soon as we could. So that's probably part of this, but how could we have proved short-term health impacts, adverse public health impacts? And if a disaster like this were to happen again, how could we prove that it is impacting human health so that can be an argument for against these facilities or to make them safer? And then how can we advocate for the long-term health impact that we might see?
So I think Ivana mentioned this earlier. It's really not possible with how the way the work the science is done to prove that something is causing something. And so with that in mind, the goal is typically to collect enough data information to establish strong associations that one can infer, maybe in part with some degree of causality, but you can never really definitively prove in these kinds of settings without some kind of controlled experiment, which you can't do, obviously. So I think what could have been done is to have something like we're proposing get put in place moving forward, that there is some rapid response of an existing plan and infrastructure and available resources, the funding, so that people can go out, in this case, he would go out and within days of the fire, be monitoring the home environments of people that are in the plume area. Have questionnaires about symptoms that they may be experiencing, follow them through time, and do a similar kind of a thing in a presumably unexposed group, in which they can compare and say, what's the frequency of, symptoms of respiratory distress in this group versus the unexposed group, and from that make inferences about the exposure from the fires may be related to that. It would have been something like that, I think.
Okay.
Can I say something? I'm not an health expert by any means, but I live here. And so I live in Prunedale, which, I just saw the smoke plume that just followed me when I ran away from here. I was looking out, like, oh, okay, it's coming. And and I know by direct experience that many of the people who live in my area don't go to the official medical establishment for health issues. In other words, there's an unseen majority that we don't account for. And that worried me when I heard about some reports about, how many people were actually reporting respiratory issues, etc. I was thinking, you're not hearing from the actual people here. You're hearing from a subset, and most of them don't live here because, yeah. So that's the part that I also,
it's important.
Yeah, because there's a network, there's a whole world underneath that we don't, well, underneath. That's not even right there in front of us that we don't just look at. It just, and that goes back to what we were talking about, there was some area where they want to set up a new, we want to push this thing, we don't want to see those things, right? There should be, we want the energy, but we want to deal with the consequence. So the same thing in terms of health. There's there are not official channels, and I think a study should actually probably map that level of, I don't know if you have any information, right?
No, well, there's colleagues that I've worked with over the years from UC Berkeley that have been doing studies in the Salinas Valley in families of agricultural workers, which you're referring to, I think. Looking at mostly pesticides, but we also looked at metals and manganese, because manganese has been used in an herbicide called Manad for many years. And they were able to show that, the proximity to agricultural fields where these pesticides, including Manad, had been applied, that there are higher concentrations in the dust outside their homes, higher concentrations of manganese, other metals related to pesticides in their homes. Those are associated with various adverse health outcomes in the children of these agricultural workers. So that kind of work has been done looking at these underrepresented sort of marginalized groups. And it's 100% I agree that they are clearly more susceptible for a lot of reasons, including their potential to suffer more elevated exposures, less likely to see medical attention, and evade any kind of monitoring. So they are sort of a silent group that has a greater risk that they could be impacted, and we all recognize.
It is 4:00, but I'm sure you can come up and ask questions later, but I want to end promptly because I know some people need to go, but I want to thank our panel, all of our speakers today, everyone who zoomed in, everyone who's in the room today, our students who set up and got the food for us and everything. And just most of all, I think it's really inspiring to see how many people care about Elkhorn Slough and the organisms and the people who live here and who care about science and understanding the world around them. So thank you all, and you can come ask some more questions, but we'll end for now.
Thank you.